3 humans stood before the Galactic Council. The galaxy was not prepared. The message came in on a Tuesday, not a quiet Tuesday either. I was elbow-deep in a failing coolant line when Petty Officer Riku Sato leaned into the engine bay and told me that 42 alien governments had formally requested our presence at their highest court of galactic authority. He said it the same way he might report a loose bolt. Calm, flat, absolutely no drama. I pulled my hands out and stared at him. 42, I said. 42 confirmed, he said. Dr. Tomás Vega says there may be a 43rd still deciding. I wiped my hands on a rag and stood up slowly. The coolant line could wait. The message had been sitting in our deep scan receiver for 6 days, encoded on a frequency that humanity had first detected 3 years ago and had been arguing about ever since. Some people thought it was a natural pulsar pattern. Others thought it was a test. A small group of researchers at a university in Cape Town cracked the encoding on a Thursday afternoon and had a complete translation by Saturday morning. The translation was short. It said, roughly, "Your species has been observed. Your presence is required. Arrival coordinates attached. Non-attendance will be noted. No greeting, no pleasantries, no hope this message finds you well." Earth's government spent 11 months deciding who to send. They needed someone capable of representing the entire human species before an assembly of civilizations that had been traveling between stars before humans had invented writing. They needed someone diplomatic, calm, and wise. They sent me, Commander Yara Osai, 38 years old, former Deep Space Survey pilot, fluent in 4 Earth languages and 0 alien ones. My mother always said I talked too much. The council was about to find out she was right. They also sent Tomás Vega, who had 3 doctorates in xenobiology and a notepad he never put down, and Riku Sato, who could fix anything mechanical with whatever was available, and who had once repaired a plasma relay using a fork and a piece of wire. Between the 3 of us, we represented humanity. I chose not to think too hard about what that meant. The Council space station was called something in an alien language that our translation system rendered as the place of final agreement. I privately called it the Big Ring because it was shaped like an enormous ring, and that was easier to say. It was 4 kilometers across. It rotated slowly against the backdrop of an unfamiliar star system, and when our small ship came in on approach, I felt something settle in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. It was more like the feeling you get standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. We were met by a docking officer of a species called the Muresh. They were roughly humanoid, taller than any person I had ever met, with pale silver skin and eyes that never seemed to blink. The Muresh officer looked at our ship the way a person looks at a child's drawing. Then it looked at us. Then it looked at the ship again. It gave us a docking bay in the lower ring, the lowest level, the one, I later learned, reserved for species presenting petitions, species with no standing, species that were expected to ask for things and then leave quietly. I noticed, I said nothing. The council chamber itself was something I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately. Imagine a room large enough to fit a small city inside it. The ceiling was a transparent dome showing open space, stars visible in every direction. Around the chamber, tiered galleries rose in curved layers, and in those galleries sat representatives of 42 civilizations. Some looked like nothing I had any word for. Some were familiar enough to make my brain try to assign categories that were completely wrong. One species, the Dorathi, filled an entire upper gallery by themselves. They were large and still, and they watched everything without expression. At the center of the room was a raised platform. Sitting on it, behind a curved table of dark material that seemed to absorb light, were the senior arbiters, 7 of them. The most senior, a species called the Velkarn, had been running these proceedings for what Tomás had told me was roughly 400 years. The Velkarn looked ancient. They moved slowly and spoke in a voice that sounded like someone reading a document out loud. Below the arbiter's platform, down on the floor level, there were several podiums. Big ones, ornate ones, fitted with translation equipment and standing lights. Those were clearly the important ones. Our podium was to the left, against the wall, small enough that the three of us standing at it felt slightly crowded. It had no standing light. The translation unit on it was an older model. Tamaz immediately started drawing a diagram of the chamber in his notepad. Riku looked up at the ceiling dome and said, very quietly, "That connecting joint at the north apex has significant stress fracturing. It would not pass safety inspection." I said, "Please do not say that out loud to anyone else." The senior arbiter began the session. The opening address took 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, humanity was referred to as the pre-integration terrestrial anomaly, an unregistered biological presence, and a curiosity of limited developmental significance. We were told that our presence was noted but provisional. We were informed that the Council had certain expectations of new species. We were given a list of those expectations. It was long. At no point did anyone say hello. When the address ended, the senior arbiter turned to our podium and said, in a tone that expected only one kind of answer, "You may now state your petition." I stepped to the front of the podium. I was aware of 42 sets of alien eyes on me, plus the arbiters, plus the Dorathi gallery, which seemed to have shifted slightly in our direction. I was aware that I was standing in the most important room in the known galaxy, representing a planet that had only known about this room for 3 years, speaking on behalf of 8 billion people who had no idea what I was about to say. I said, "We don't have one." The silence that followed was extraordinary. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a packed room in which every single occupant has stopped moving at the same moment. The senior arbiter's expression, already difficult for me to read, became entirely unreadable. Several of the other arbiters leaned toward each other and appeared to confer in rapid, low tones that the translation unit didn't catch. One of the gallery representatives, a species I didn't recognize, made a sound that our translator rendered as error. Tamaz was still writing in his notepad. He had not looked up. Riku was watching the ceiling joint again. The senior arbiter asked me to repeat what I had said. I repeated it. "We don't have a petition. Earth did not send us here to ask for anything." Another silence, shorter this time. Then the senior arbiter asked the question that I could already tell was going to define the rest of our time in that chamber. "Then why," it said slowly, carefully, as if testing each word, "are you here?" I had prepared for this question. I had rehearsed several answers on the ship. Diplomatic answers. Careful, measured, respectful answers that acknowledged the Council's authority and framed humanity's presence in terms that could not be misunderstood or misused. I said, "We came to see what was out here." The senior arbiter stared at me for a long time. Behind me, I heard Tamaz quietly turn a page in his notepad and begin a new diagram. That was how it started. The Council recessed within 15 minutes of my answer. This was, Tamaz later told me with great satisfaction, apparently unprecedented. No species had ever caused a recess before their petition had been formally registered. No species had ever arrived without a petition at all. The entire bureaucratic system of the Galactic Council was built around a simple cycle. Species appear, species petition, Council deliberates, Council rules, species accepts or disputes ruling, process repeats. We had broken the cycle at step 1. I felt mildly proud of this. I kept it off my face. During the recess, we were guided to a waiting room off the main chamber. It was a comfortable room by alien standards, which meant it had atmospheric controls, surfaces that could be sat on, and soft lighting. It also had a view of the station's inner ring through a long, transparent wall. And I stood there and watched alien transport vessels move back and forth in the interior docking corridors, while Tamaz covered his 3rd page of notes, and Riku looked at every mechanical component in the room, with the quiet focus of a man who was already identifying things that could be improved. A representative approached us during the recess. It was one of the Velkarn, not the senior arbiter, but a younger one, if younger meant anything for a species that apparently lived for centuries. The Velkarn moved carefully, draped in layered gray robes, and stopped at a respectful distance from us before speaking. "You have confused the council," it said, not as an accusation, more as a straightforward observation, the way you might tell someone their shoelace was undone. "I noticed," I said. "Species come here with needs," the Velkarn said. "That is the function of this place. Needs are presented, assessed, and addressed where possible. It is an efficient system." "It sounds efficient," I agreed. "Your species has no need." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Our species has many needs," I said. "We just didn't bring them here. We came here to understand what kind of place this is before we decide what to ask." The Velkarn was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "That is not a thing species do." "It's a thing we do," I said. The Velkarn left without another word. Tamaz had written the entire exchange down verbatim without looking up. When the session resumed, the dynamic in the chamber had changed. I could feel it. Before, we had been a curiosity. Now there was an edge of something else in the room. Not hostility exactly. More like the way a room feels when everyone in it has simultaneously realized that a situation is not what they assumed it was, and nobody is sure yet what it actually is. The council asked us a series of questions. The questions were, I realized quickly, not really questions. They were structured prompts designed to move us toward filing a petition. Does your world require protection? That was an invitation to ask for military alliance. Does your species require resources? That was the door to trade dependency. Does your civilization seek advancement? That was the path to technology licensing, which came with conditions and costs attached. I answered each one the same way, honestly and sideways. Does your world require protection? From what specifically? We've been fine so far. Does your species require resources? We have resources. We're still learning what we have. Does your civilization seek advancement? We advance constantly. We were hopping to compare notes. By the third answer, one of the Dorathi in the upper gallery had leaned forward. I noticed this. I filed it away. Tamaz, meanwhile, had made a request. During the first recess, he had passed a written note through our translation unit to the council's administrative desk asking for access to the biological taxonomy archive, the council's comprehensive record of every known species' physiological data. He wanted it for research. He had framed the request with great politeness and attached 3 pages of his own preliminary xenobiological notes as a demonstration of good faith and scholarly intent. The Velkarn archivist who handled the response appeared personally in our waiting room to express something that the translator rendered as institutional distress. No species had ever asked to read the archive. The archive existed so that species could be entered into it, assessed, cataloged, and assigned a classification tier. The archive was not a library. Tamaz requesting access to it was apparently the equivalent of going to a government registry office and asking to read everyone else's files. Tamaz listened to all of this carefully. Then he asked if there was a rule specifically prohibiting it. There was a very long pause. There was not a rule specifically prohibiting it, because no one had ever tried. Tamaz was granted provisional access under a newly drafted clause that the Velkarn archivist appeared to create on the spot, with the expression of someone doing something they deeply disagreed with. Tamaz thanked them sincerely and asked for a comfortable chair. Riku's incident happened during the afternoon session. The afternoon session involved a long procedural debate between 2 established species over a border territory dispute that had apparently been ongoing for 60 years. It had nothing to do with us, and we sat at our small podium and waited. After an hour, Riku quietly leaned over and told me he was going to find a bathroom. I told him fine. He was gone for 40 minutes. He came back carrying a small atmospheric regulation unit about the size of a shoebox, its casing open, its internal components rearranged. He said there was a unit in the corridor making a noise. I adjusted the airflow valve. The pressure differential was causing a resonance vibration in the casing. It's fixed now. I looked at him, then at the unit, then at him again. Did you take that out of the wall? It was making a noise, he said again, as if this answered the question completely. It did not answer the question completely. 20 minutes later, a council maintenance officer appeared at our podium with an expression that our translator rendered as official severity, and informed us that Riku had committed an act of unsanctioned contact with sovereign council infrastructure. This was a formal breach of protocol. It carried a warning classification. A record was being made. Riku accepted the citation with complete calm. He asked if the officer wanted him to put the unit back. The officer said the unit was functioning correctly for the first time in 8 months. Riku nodded as if this was obviously what happened when you fix something. The citation was processed. Riku took the printed copy. He folded it once carefully and put it in his breast pocket. Later, back on the ship, I would find that he had placed it on the small shelf above his bunk, propped against the wall. He had framed it. Technically, he had taped a strip of spare wire around the edges, but the intention was clear. The Dorathi found me during the second recess. Not in the waiting room this time. In the corridor outside it, where I had stepped to collect my thoughts. 2 of them approached together. They were significantly taller than me, and they moved with the kind of measured quiet that very large things sometimes have, like they were always slightly containing themselves. The lead Dorathi stopped at a distance of perhaps 1 meter, and looked at me with dark, steady eyes. You will file a petition, it said. This was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as an instruction delivered by someone accustomed to instructions being followed. I looked up at it. Will I? All species file petitions. This is how the council functions. Without a petition, your presence here has no defined purpose. A species with no defined purpose is an irregularity. Irregularities are resolved. Resolved how? I asked. By giving them a defined purpose, the Dorathi said, or by removing them from the process. I thought about this for a moment. Then I said, where is your homeworld? What's it like? The Dorathi paused. That is not relevant to this conversation. I'm curious, I said. I've never met a Dorathi before. I've never met anyone before, actually. This is all new to us. You've probably had hundreds of years of this kind of meeting. We've had 3. The Dorathi looked at me for a long time. I got the impression it was searching for a response in a set of prepared categories and not finding the right one. You will file a petition, it said again, but there was something slightly different in the tone. Not softer exactly. More like a door that had been firmly shut and was now simply closed. I said thank you for the advice. I meant it genuinely. The Dorathi left. I watched them go and thought about something I had noticed in chambers back home, in government rooms and boardrooms and negotiation tables. When someone is used to being obeyed, they have a particular way of reacting to not being obeyed. Some of them get angry. Some of them get louder. Some of them lean in harder, push the same argument with more force, expecting that persistence will eventually produce the desired result. But some of them, the interesting ones, get quiet. They stop. They look at you differently. They file something away. The Dorathi who had just spoken to me were the quiet kind. I went back to the waiting room and told Tamaz what had happened. He was reading the archive. He had reading glasses on that he only wore when he was completely absorbed in something. Without looking up, he said, "That's the species responsible for enforcement of council rulings. They remove species from the process." I gathered that. I said, "They've never been refused a petition demand before," he said. I checked. "How do you know that?" He held up the archive on the tablet screen. "It's all in here." I sat down across from him and looked at the ceiling. Back home, on Earth, in 100 different historical moments, someone had always been the first person to do the thing that wasn't supposed to be done, to walk through the door that was supposed to be for someone else, to ask the question no one had asked. Usually they got into trouble for it. Usually, eventually, it mattered. By the end of the first day, I wrote in my log that night, sitting in my bunk on the ship, we had accidentally made 3 enemies, 1 confused ally, and Riku had been issued a formal citation for unauthorized infrastructure maintenance. I paused, listening to the quiet hum of our small ship. He framed it, I added. The archive access was the thing that changed everything. Not immediately, not with any announcement or moment of revelation. It happened the way most important things happen, quietly, through a door that nobody was watching. Tamaz had been given a tablet, a corner of the Velkarn archive wing, and a chair that was slightly too tall for him but which he fixed by wedging his bag under his feet. He had been reading for 14 hours straight across 2 days. The archive was, by his estimate, the most extraordinary collection of biological data ever assembled. Every known species. Atmospheric requirements, physiological maps, reproductive cycles, ecological dependencies, population records going back thousands of years. He was reading it like a scientist. He was reading it like someone who had spent his career studying life on a single planet and had just been handed a record of every other planet that had ever produced any. He found the Ashari data on the second morning. The Ashari were a mid-tier species. The archive described them as stable and cooperative, long-standing members of the Council's Eastern Trade Corridor. They had been members for 200 years. Their homeworld was a temperate planet with complex ecosystems and a recorded history of careful environmental stewardship. Tamaz flipped to their current atmospheric records. He read for a few minutes. Then he turned to the population trend data. Then the agricultural output records. Then he went back to the atmospheric data and read it again more slowly. He came to me during the morning session break and sat down across from me and placed the tablet on the table between us. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of measurements. I looked. The numbers meant nothing to me on their own. "Explain it to me," I said. He did, slowly, in plain language. The Ashari's upper atmospheric particulate levels had been rising steadily for 30 years. The rate was not dramatic. It was gradual enough that any single year's data looked unremarkable compared to the year before. But 30 years of gradual added up to something that was no longer gradual at all. The particulate increase was cutting solar absorption. That was reducing surface temperatures. That was disrupting the moisture cycle across the northern growing regions. I looked at him. "You're saying they're in the early stages of ecological collapse." "I'm saying the numbers look exactly like the data from 12 pre-collapse case studies I wrote my second thesis on," he said. "The patterns are the same. The timeline, if nothing changes, leads to the same outcome." "How long?" I asked. 40 years until crop failure begins in the northern hemisphere. 80 until the southern hemisphere follows. After that, the modeling gets very difficult. I sat with that for a moment, and the Council knows about this. He picked the tablet back up and navigated to the administrative log attached to the Ashari file. He turned it toward me. There were 11 flagged reviews over the past 30 years. 11 times someone had looked at the atmospheric data and raised a concern. 11 times the concern had been logged as under review. No action. No response. Just the log entry, sitting there, growing older. I went into the afternoon session with a different weight in my chest than I had carried before. The afternoon session was dealing with a treaty amendment between 2 species I had not yet learned to tell apart visually. The senior arbiter was reading clauses aloud. Representatives were indicating agreement through small gestures that our translator handled with the label procedural assent. Everything was orderly. Everything was slow and procedural, and absolutely focused on the treaty in front of it. I waited for the clause reading to pause. When it did, I pressed the podium's floor button, the one that indicated a representative wished to speak. The button lit up a small amber light on the arbiter's table. The senior arbiter looked at our podium with an expression I was starting to learn meant something like resigned patience. "The terrestrial representatives have the floor," it said. I stepped to the front of the podium. "I want to discuss the Ashari," I said. The room did not go silent immediately. It went through several stages. First, there was a slight increase in the ambient translation murmur as representatives spoke quietly among themselves. Then that faded. Then it was quiet, not the confused quiet of my first address, something older, something more deliberate. The senior arbiter said, "The Ashari are not a subject of today's agenda." "I understand," I said. "I still want to discuss them." "Is this matter connected to a petition you wish to file?" the arbiter asked. I heard the hopefulness in the question. "No," I said. "It's connected to data in the council archive that describes what looks like an advancing ecological crisis on an inhabited world, and 11 flagged reviews that appear to have produced no action." The room was very quiet now. I kept my voice even. I had spent the previous evening choosing every word carefully, not because I was angry, but because I needed the words to do their job without being pulled apart. "We've seen this before," I said. "Not on another planet, on ours. We've spent the last 150 years fighting the effects of environmental degradation that we waited too long to address. Some of those fights we are still losing. Some we turned around. We know what the early data looks like." "It looks like the Ashari file." A representative from the trade block gallery made a sound. The translator rendered it as procedural objection. I kept going. The Ashari have 200 years of responsible environmental stewardship in their own record. They are not careless, but they sit on a trade corridor that serves 18 economic agreements. Addressing their atmospheric issue would require temporary restrictions on industrial output. That would affect those agreements. I understand why that is complicated. I looked up at the gallery directly. But complicated is not the same as impossible, and waiting is not the same as reviewing. The senior arbiter said, "The Ashari situation has been noted and is under ongoing assessment." I looked at Tamaz. He had his notepad. I said clearly to him, not to the chamber, "He means they're waiting for it to become someone else's problem." I said it the way you say something to a friend, not to a room. But I said it at a podium with translation equipment, and every representative in that chamber heard it through their receivers, rendered into their own languages, perfectly clear. The silence was different this time. The Dorathi upper gallery had gone very still, not the stillness of disengagement, the stillness of attention. The senior arbiter began a response about the council's extensive review processes. I listened to it. I let it finish. Then I said, "We'd like to table a remediation proposal." The arbiter stopped. "Not a petition," I said quickly. "We're not asking for anything. We're offering something. A plan, based on existing technology that Earth currently uses for atmospheric correction, adapted to the Ashari's specific atmospheric chemistry." I looked at Riku. He had been sitting quietly for the entire session, as he usually did, watching things and thinking about them. He reached into the bag at his feet and pulled out 2 pages of printed work. A plan he had spent the previous night putting together on our ship's computer, running models, cross-referencing Tamaz's data, calculating material requirements and implementation timelines. 2 pages, double-spaced, clear headings. He had even drawn a small diagram in the margin. He placed the pages on the podium. I held them up for the chamber to see. 2 pages, I said, not 200 years. The chamber erupted, not in anger exactly, more in the sound of 42 species speaking simultaneously, which is a sound I do not have adequate words for. It was not quiet for a long time. The senior arbiter called 3 recesses in the next 2 hours. Representatives came to speak to us in the corridor outside. Some were furious. A delegate from the Muresh trade bloc told me that we had exceeded appropriate standing, and that our proposal was an unsolicited interference in established equilibrium. I thanked them for their perspective. A junior researcher from the archive wing found Tamaz in the waiting room and asked him, with great urgency and what appeared to be genuine excitement, if his thesis data was available for cross-reference. He said yes and gave her his notes. The Dorathi did not approach me, but when I passed the corridor where they were standing during the second recess, the lead one that had spoken to me earlier turned slightly in my direction. Just slightly. A fraction of a degree. Enough. I wrote in my log that night. The arbiter asked me who gave us authority to table a remediation proposal. I told him nobody. That's usually how it works back home. I paused. Tamaz says there are 6 more cases in the archive that look like the Ashari. We're going to have a busy week. The Synthene Compact sent their representative to our waiting room the following morning before the session opened. We had not met the Synthene before. They were not a species that appeared in the main gallery. They occupied a private observation box above the Dorathi level, and their representative came alone, without announcement, and stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to make silence feel like a statement. I stood up when I saw them. You do not sit when the Synthene Compact sends you a visitor. I did not know this as a cultural rule before that moment, but I understood it immediately. Some things communicate themselves. The representative was smaller than I expected. Slight, with extremely pale skin and eyes that had no visible white around the iris, just dark color, edge to edge. When it spoke, its voice came out at a register that sat just below what felt comfortable. Your proposal for the Ashari, it said. You intend to proceed with it. We intend to present it properly, yes, I said. It will fail, the representative said. The 17 treaty signatories on the Eastern Corridor have no incentive to permit atmospheric intervention. The economic disruption would be significant. They will vote against. Maybe, I said. Not maybe, the representative said. Certainly. We have been members of this council for 900 years. We know how votes are conducted. I said, then what are you here to tell me? That you should be careful, it said. You are new. You do not yet understand what it means to make certain kinds of enemies in this place. The Muresh have long memories. The Velkarn archive operates under our guidance. Your ship is small. Your planet is very far away. I held its gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then I said, thank you for coming to tell me personally. The representative looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode. Then it left. When it was gone, Riku said, from the corner where he had been quietly reconfiguring a water recycling valve he had brought from the ship. That was a threat. Yes, I said. They're worried, he said. He didn't look up from the valve. Yes, I said again. Tamaz came in from the archive wing, notepad in hand, reading glasses on. He sat down, pushed the glasses up, and said, I found 2 more cases. One is worse than the Ashari. He placed the notepad on the table. Are we still doing this? I looked at them both. Riku, focused on his valve. Tamaz, watching me over his glasses with the patient expression of a man who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the confirmation. Yes, I said, we're still doing this. The censure motion arrived during the morning session. It was filed jointly by the Muresh bloc and the Velkarn administrative branch, co-signed by 6 other species I had barely spoken to. The motion had 4 parts: formal censure of our conduct for procedural irregularities, temporary impoundment of our vessel pending compliance review, a request for Earth to submit a formal apology to the Council for unregistered interference, and a proposal to reclassify Earth as a restricted pre-integration world, which meant no Council contact, no access to galactic trade routes, no communication, sealed off, For how long the motion did not specify. The phrasing used was, until such time as compliance is demonstrated. The senior arbiter read the motion aloud in full. The chamber listened. I sat at our podium and listened. I felt something very cold settle through me that had nothing to do with the atmospheric controls. This was not just about us. This was 8 billion people, cut off from the galaxy before they had ever really been part of it. This was my planet. This was the conversation we had just barely started, ended before anyone had understood what it was. I breathed in. I breathed out. I looked at Tamaz, who was writing. I looked at Riku, who had closed his eyes not because he was frightened but because he was thinking. I knew the difference by now. The debate on the motion was long. 7 species spoke in favor. The Muresh delegate was methodical and precise, listing every breach of protocol we had committed from the moment we arrived, in order, with supporting citations. It was an impressive document. The Velkarn arbiter noted that our actions had created significant institutional instability. The Muresh described Riku's citation as evidence of a pattern of disregard for council sovereignty. I listened to our single-day history being assembled into an argument for our exclusion, and I made myself hear it clearly, without flinching, because I needed to understand every piece of it before I could respond. 3 species spoke against the motion. The first was a small coastal world species I had never spoken to, who said only that humanity had not yet had the opportunity to understand the rules it was accused of breaking. The second was a middle gallery species I recognized as one of the ones that Tamaz had been quietly exchanging notes with through the archive wing researchers. They cited our Ashari data directly. The third was unexpected. The Dorathi spoke. Not the 2 who had approached me in the corridor. The full gallery. A single voice from their senior delegate, slow and considered and absolutely clear. The impound motion is procedurally invalid, the Dorathi said. Under Council Regulation 44, provisional impound orders may not be filed against vessels operating under active observer status. The terrestrial vessel arrived under observer designation. This designation has not been revoked. The impound motion cannot proceed. The chamber buzzed. The Muresh delegate pointed out, with barely contained frustration, that observer status was supposed to be assigned by the Council, not assumed by an arriving species. The Dorathi delegate said, the terrestrials did not file a petition. A species without a petition has no standing as a claimant. A species with no standing as a claimant has, by process of elimination, arrived in an observer capacity. The regulation applies. There was a long silence, then an enormous amount of noise. In the middle of it, Riku leaned over to me and said, the regulation was written to prevent member species from detaining each other's observation teams. It was never intended to apply to new arrivals. I know, I said. The Dorathi know that too, he said. I know, I said. The vote on the censure motion took place after a third recess. I stood at the podium while the count was conducted species by species, each representative entering their decision through a console on their desk. The chamber was very quiet during the count, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. The motion failed by 3 votes. The number settled into me and stayed there. 3 votes, the same number as us. When the session adjourned, the Synthene Compact's representative appeared in the doorway of our waiting room again. Same stillness, same dark eyes. It said nothing for a moment. Then it said, you are more difficult to predict than anticipated. I said, I get that a lot. It left without another word. Tamaz looked up from his notes. Are you afraid? He asked. I looked at the doorway the representative had just passed through. Then at the station beyond our room's window, then at the small, far star that was visible through the outer hull panel, our sun, or something near enough to it that looking at it felt like looking home. Terrified, I said honestly. Then why do you keep smiling? Tamaz asked. I thought about the Synthene, 900 years old, and worried about 3 people from a planet they barely knew existed. I thought about the Dorathi enforcer using a regulation to protect us, not because they were our allies, but because the regulation was being used incorrectly, and they could not allow that. I thought about the archive researcher who had come looking for Tamaz's notes with bright, eager eyes that looked, no matter the species, exactly like the eyes of a scientist who has just found something real. Because they think we came here by accident, I said. We had 4 days left on the station. 4 days in which the galaxy recalibrated around us in ways both large and small, and we moved through it the way we had always moved through difficult and unfamiliar things, by paying attention and not stopping. Tamaz spent those 4 days in the archive. The Velkarn archivist who had initially been horrified by his request had slowly, reluctantly, and then with increasing engagement, begun having conversations with him about methodology. On the 3rd day, Tamaz reported that the archivist had corrected him on a point of atmospheric chemistry, and that the correction had led to a 3-hour discussion that he described as the best conversation of my professional life. He had shared everything he had brought from Earth, every case study, every data set, every failure, every recovery. He shared it without conditions, without treaties, without asking for anything in return. The archive now held, filed under terrestrial supplemental contributions, more detailed ecological recovery data than it had ever contained for any new species. Tamaz left copies of his contact information on a note for the archivist. The archivist, Tamaz said, had received this with an expression that translated as institutional uncertainty, but that looked to him very much like someone trying not to smile. Riku spent those 4 days being quietly, productively impossible. The Dorathi engineering officer found him on the 2nd morning. He had been, as Yara noted, someone who had watched Riku's repair of the atmospheric unit from a distance, and then watched the formal citation being issued, and then watched the unit continue to operate perfectly, and had been thinking about the contradiction ever since. The officer approached Riku in the corridor outside the archive wing and said, with careful formality, "There is a pressure regulation system in the lower ring that has been producing irregular output for 3 months. The maintenance team has been unable to identify the source." A pause. If you were to observe it informally, no record would be created. Riku said, "Show me." He was gone for 6 hours. When he came back, he told me the problem had been a misaligned calibration sequence 2 systems upstream from where every repair attempt had been focused, which caused a cascade effect that looked like the endpoint system failing but was actually fine. He had recalibrated the upstream sequence. The pressure regulation was now normal. He said this the way he said everything, simply, without emphasis. The Dorathi engineering officer sent a formal, unsigned note to our waiting room later that day. It said, "The system is functioning correctly. No further action required." And then, below the official close, in slightly different script that looked like it had been added after, "If additional consultation were ever available, it would be of value." I did not say anything to Riku about this note. I placed it on the table where he could see it and watched him read it and put it in his pocket. He did not comment on it. He did not need to. The Ashari remediation proposal went to a full council vote on the 4th day. This was faster than anything had ever gone to vote before, according to Tamaz, who had read enough of the archive to have a reasonable sense of council timelines. Usually the process from proposal to vote took months, sometimes years. The speed of this vote was itself a kind of result, a signal that the chamber wanted the matter decided before it became something larger. I presented the proposal myself. I stood at the podium that had started as the smallest in the room, and that now felt like the only important one, and I walked through the plan that Riku had written on 2 pages, and that Tamaz had expanded into a full technical document over 4 days of archive access and consultation, with 3 willing Velkarn researchers. The plan was not complicated. Stratospheric particulate seeding using a compound Earth had developed for its own atmospheric correction, adaptable to the Ashari's specific chemistry, with modifications our team had worked out. Initial cost in materials was significant but manageable. Implementation could begin within 2 years. The disruption to trade corridor operations would be minimal during the first phase and could be scheduled around existing shipping cycles. Timeline to measurable atmospheric improvement, 8 years. Timeline to full stabilization, 22 years. 2 pages had become 38. The core of it was still Riku's. I spoke for 12 minutes. I did not read from the document. I had spent the previous night memorizing what I wanted to say, not word for word, but the shape of it, what it was, what it meant. I told the chamber that this proposal was not a criticism of the council's process. I told them it was not a claim that Earth knew better. I said that we had brought this forward because we had the data, and having the data and not bringing it forward would be the kind of decision that an 8-year-old would understand was wrong, and I was fairly confident that was still true regardless of what species you were or how old your civilization was. I said that the Ashari had been good stewards of their world for 200 years, that they had earned the response that something more than a log entry could give them, that this was not complicated, that complicated was not the same as impossible. I said that Earth was willing to sponsor the proposal not because we were powerful or wise, but because we had failed at this before and survived and learned from it. And the only thing we knew for certain was that waiting always cost more than acting. Then I stepped back from the podium, and the vote began. The Muresh bloc voted against. The Synthene Compact voted against. 4 others voted against. Everyone else voted in favor. The proposal passed. Provisional, Earth as sponsor, terms to be agreed within 60 days. Humanity had just become, officially and on record, a participant in a galactic process. Not a member, not yet, but a participant, a presence. Something the Council would now have to account for going forward because we were attached to a live proposal with a 22-year timeline, and you could not simply remove us from the process without the proposal collapsing. We had walked in with no petition, and walked out with responsibility for an entire world's recovery. I thought, when the vote result was announced, that I would feel something dramatic. I thought my chest would open up with relief or triumph or some version of the feeling you get at the end of a very long run. What I felt instead was quiet. The same quiet I had felt on approach to this station, standing at the edge of something and looking down. Only now I could see some of the bottom. The senior arbiter concluded the session with a formal notation of the vote result and a list of next steps for the provisional sponsorship terms. At the very end, it paused in the way it paused when it was preparing to say something that had not been prepared in advance. It said, "The Council acknowledges the terrestrial delegation's participation in these proceedings. Your conduct has been irregular. It has also been consequential. These are not always compatible qualities. In this case, they appear to be." This was, from the senior arbiter, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Tamaz wrote it down. Riku nodded slightly. I said thank you. We left the chamber on the 4th evening and walked back to our docking bay through corridors that felt different than they had when we arrived. Not friendlier exactly, but more aware. Species stepped slightly aside when we passed, not in deference, but in that careful way that means you have been noticed and placed in a different category than before. A junior Muresh representative passed us without eye contact. 2 Velkarn researchers stopped and smiled at Tamaz, if smiling was the right word for what their faces did. The Dorathi engineering officer was near our docking bay when we arrived, standing at a junction, apparently occupied with something on a handheld device. It did not look up as we passed. Riku slowed slightly as we went by. The officer said without looking up, "Safe travel." Riku said, "You too." We got on the ship. I sat at the pilot's console, and started the pre-departure sequence. The familiar sounds of our ship coming alive around me, the gentle thrum of the drives, the click of systems checking themselves, felt more comfortable than I had words for. I had been in diplomatic spaces and institutional chambers and alien waiting rooms for 4 days. This was my ship. These were my people. Tamaz came and sat in the co-pilot seat and put his notepad on his knee and started writing. He had been writing almost continuously since we arrived and showed no signs of stopping. Riku went directly to the engine bay to check the coolant line I had been working on when the summons arrived. I heard the familiar sounds of him moving things, tapping things, the occasional quiet sound of something being adjusted correctly. We departed the big ring at 1400 hours, station time. I watched it recede in the rear display until it was a small bright point, and then just a point, and then nothing visible against the stars. I started my report to Earth. The report was supposed to be formal, structured, delivered in the standard debrief format. I wrote the headings. I filled in the date and the mission designation. I stared at the blank space under the first section header for a while. Then I started writing. I described the chamber. I described the podium they had given us. I described the Velkarn and the Dorathi and the Muresh and the Synthene, and I described them accurately, without softening and without exaggeration. I described what they were capable of, the age and complexity of what they had built, the scale of it. I described the ways in which they were brilliant. I described the ways in which they were afraid. Not afraid of us specifically. Afraid of change the way you are when you have lived so long in a particular structure that the structure has become invisible to you, and the idea of it being different has become the thing you call danger. A species can be ancient and powerful and still be afraid. Usually, in my experience, the more powerful something is, the more carefully it guards against the thing that might require it to be different. We had walked in and been different before they could prepare for it. That was all. That was the whole of it. I wrote for 3 hours. Outside the ship, space moved past in silence, the stars unchanging, the distances between things vast and patient and indifferent to whatever we were working out among ourselves. Then the message came. It arrived on our standard deep scan receiver, flagged Council Origin, formal encryption, 17 pages long. The provisional sponsorship terms. Dense, technical, full of clauses and sub-clauses and administrative language that I would need a full day to work through properly. I opened it and started reading. 15 pages, 16, 17. At the very end, below the official close, below the certifying signatures of 3 arbiters, there was a single additional line. It was brief. It was phrased with the same careful, procedural formality as the rest of the document. It had clearly been added after everything else was settled, because it was not really administrative at all. It said, query, does Earth have additional representatives available for future sessions? I read it 3 times. Then I laughed, quietly to myself in the dark of the pilot's bay, a real laugh, the kind that comes up without warning. Tamaz looked over from the co-pilot seat. What is it? I passed him the tablet. He read the line. He pushed his glasses up. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. 7 billion, he said, roughly. That's what I'm going to tell them, I said. I opened a reply window. Riku came forward from the engine bay and leaned against the doorframe. I showed him the screen without explanation. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Will they be ready for that? He asked. Absolutely not, I said. I began to type. The reply was short. The council had 17 pages. I had 3 sentences. I wrote, yes, Earth has additional representatives available. We'll send who we can. I sent it. The ship hummed around us. The stars held still. Somewhere far behind us, in a 4-kilometer ring station orbiting an unfamiliar sun, a message was arriving in the inbox of the oldest diplomatic institution in the known galaxy. A message from a planet that had not known the galaxy existed 3 years ago. A planet that had shown up without a petition, fixed a hallway appliance, read the archive, and left with responsibility for a dying world's recovery and a 2-decade commitment to see it through. A planet of 8 billion people, give or take, who had never quite managed to agree on anything but had always, somehow, kept moving anyway. I leaned back in my seat. The stars were beautiful, they always were. "We should probably have a plan," Tomas said, still writing in his notepad. "We will by the time we get home," I said. Riku went back to the engine bay. A moment later I heard the familiar sound of something being adjusted, something small, something that had probably been making a noise. "Fixed now,"